and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is James Nixey. He is director at Russia-Eurasia program at Chatham House in London. Welcome, James.
Thank you for having me, Sergey. It's such a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you so much for having joined our program. And we are currently facing a very interesting regular event in Russia, which is not so often happens as Christmas, but is as symbolic as one. It is the so-called elections of President of Russia, or we should better say elections of Vladimir Putin. And we have now these four candidates, including Putin himself. But my first question is, why are elections so important for Putin? It is obvious that he will be re-elected, or that his result would confirm that he stays in power. Why to bother?
Well, it's a fascinating and slightly tricky, slightly paradoxical answer. And there's a degree of speculation, we have to concede. But I suppose now that he has started with elections, as you say, he's held them often enough. He can't really stop. It would be awkward to do so. He did come into power in 2000, as you may recall, Sergei, and said he was suspicious of elections. He didn't like their unpredictability, which, of course, to you and me is the whole point. But I think that it is strange, because you do have to wonder why they bother, because elections are times of vulnerability for anyone, right? Yes, on the one hand, I understand that Russia doesn't want to be perceived quite as North Korea, but on the other hand, they are clearly times of weakness. We have seen elections trigger colour revolutions in the past. So you do wonder why they take the risk. I suppose they perceive it as a risk either way. There would be a risk to not holding them, and to therefore declaring yourself an out-and-out official autocracy. And there is a risk of having one, that it will provide the impetus for a snowballing grassroots protest, which comes into something more. So I think that basically they've trodden themselves down this path, and they can't escape from it. And they've just ultimately and I think you and I both know, Sergei, that it does get harder and harder to manipulate. You know, it's easy after 4 years, a bit more difficult after 8. But the point is that the longer you go on, then the more of a caricature you become. And obviously, 24 years in, looking to a near 30-year presidency, does make Putin even to the most pro-nationalistic, patriotic, fervent supporter. It obviously must, in the back of anybody's mind, look very strange, look very hard to defend. But again, there's honestly no accounting for. I mean, Putin is far from the world's longest-serving leader, right? I mean, I haven't looked it up recently, but he's actually only about 9th or 8th in the list. So I mean, he's got some way to go. And I think ultimately, of course, the other obvious point, if you don't mind me stating the obvious, Sergei, is that it's actually dangerous not to be the leader, of course. Once you lose power, although that was successfully done in the Medvedev castling of 2008 to 2012, he didn't really lose power, of course. He just lost the position. Then you can never be totally certain that the person you put onto the throne won't acquire a power and a faction and a clan of their own, and in some way threaten your very existence. That's a long way round of putting it, I'm sorry.
Indeed, it is an explanation why he sticks to that, and we know that the danger is still there. We know that the biggest protest in Russia, one can be skeptical about Russian protests, but they had the big protests in 2012, when a mass of people in Moscow and other larger cities have realized that they will have Vladimir Putin for the next 2 presidential terms. And there had been protests in Moscow and Bolotnaya Square, and there had been among clashing with the protesters. I believe the largest and the most violent, to a certain extent, protests in Russia. And now they do the same, but they have invented a very interesting technology during the last elections, and it is called electronic voting during election of Moscow or Moscow mayor, when they just say, okay, we have received our result on our server, and this result is so many percent points. You cannot even check the voting ballots, or like recount them, what people try to do. You cannot make exit polls. You need to trust that Kremlin server knows the truth.
I mean, for what it's worth, I'm no real expert here, but it seems to me that with electronic voting, that yes, you can manipulate the vote yourself, and obviously that is very much the Kremlin's intention. But also, somebody else can manipulate your vote. So I suppose the Kremlin must fear that it might get a taste of its own medicine, and in some respect, that if it were to engage in full-scale electronic voting, that it would be open to the attacks and the infiltration that it so often baselessly accuses the West of. It must fear that the reprisals that Biden has warned of in the wake of Navalny's death, for example, that what he means is that we will interfere with your elections for real this time. So I presume that electronic voting, I suppose, cuts both ways. And is a risk to either side. And as you know, many countries, not least in Scandinavia, for example, have now decided that electronic voting is not the way forward for fear of interference.
You have already mentioned the death of Alexei Navalny, who was, it is obviously brutally murdered in a Russian prison and was obviously tortured before. There was an assassination attempt using a nerve agent, Novichok. And he dies on the opening day of the Munich Security Conference and several weeks before the so-called election. We also know that the only candidate who presented himself as a liberal candidate, one can speculate if he was not. I personally believe he was not, but still his position was that he is liberal and anti-war candidate. Nadezhdin was removed from the ballot. Is Putin more afraid now than before, and if yes, why?
It seems reasonable to surmise, doesn't it, that as you get on in age and in the job, that you become more paranoid. This does have the feelings of a totally paranoid state. We hear this, for example, in terms of Putin's response to COVID, him locking himself away in his bunker, him being germophobic, etc. And I guess that extends out to the politics and the international relations of it, and everybody's out to get me is what he presumably genuinely believes in his own mind. Although obviously there is a really interesting question as to what do they genuinely believe, and what are they just saying because it's expedient to do so, and it's a topic worth exploring, but. Obviously, as far as Nadezhdin is concerned, and actually as far as Navalny is concerned anyway, but ultimately it seems that they didn't want to take the risk, right? They felt there was some form of threat, some form of risk to having even a slightly or ostensibly or occasionally liberal-sounding alternative in the forms of those two men, and that wasn't worth it. They're much safer and happier with the systemic opposition than with the non-systemic opposition, even if the non-systemic opposition get no media coverage, are slandered and harassed and obviously imprisoned, etc. So, but nonetheless, I guess what I'm saying is paranoid regimes need to try to feel comfortable.
Indeed, and we have seen that now the number of candidates is the smallest during the all time of Russia's presidential election. Only 4 candidates, including Vladimir Putin himself. There is no liberal candidate, even no pseudo-liberal candidate. We have seen like such marionette candidates like Ksenia Sobchak before, or like the other people who had clearly no chances to be elected in Russia, but free elections. But they were presented as if there is competition. The 2 major candidates against Putin, Slutsky and Kharitonov, are not as influential as previous candidates from their party. Zhirinovsky, who has died, and Zyuganov, who doesn't candidate this time. So it will be practically the voting, even if we see it as voting, it will be just like voting of acceptance of continuations of reign of Vladimir Putin. But when we look for the time after, what can we expect after these elections? With all the situation with Russo-Ukrainian war, with all the economic crisis, with all the Russian refugees who left Russia and are living now in different countries, what will be the problems for Vladimir Putin?
It's a good question. Okay, I mean, look, obviously we're delving into the future, but that's our job, right? So let's have a crack at it. I mean, I can see that after obviously he hasn't wanted to go for mobilization before the election. That would endanger him in some respects. But I think we could probably, if we look at the war, see that Russia's going to need some form of partial mobilization in the coming months in the coming year, in the next sort of 18 months. I'm absolutely certain that they will need to re-recruit. They've exhausted the prisons, as we know. They've exhausted actually a lot of the rural areas because that was a safer thing to do, and that's going to get harder and harder for them as they move towards the cities. So that's one thing. The other thing to say is that a lot of the people in the security forces, in the security ministries, the ministries of force, they are getting on a bit. I mean, so is Putin, obviously, at 71, but that's not relevant. But at some point, he will be forced to just biologically speaking, to remove some people and to bring in a younger crowd. And I think that crowd is available. There are also people in the non-security ministries who are in their 40s and 50s who are Putin acolytes and loyal to the cause. So that won't be a problem, but I think we can see a reshuffle. And then I guess the other point I'd like to make is that obviously Putin has managed to save his country and economy by transferring it into a war economy. That's why it hasn't been hit as hard as we think. And therefore, what we have to surmise from that is that he must therefore... the war is driving the war. And therefore, to stop the war, he would therefore be stopping his own economy because he can't go back to the energy. If the war stops, we're not going back to buying Russian hydrocarbons. That's done now, and we found out we can live without it. So instead, what is going to happen is that he will be forced to double down and continue the war economy is driving the war, and the war is driving the war economy. They're mutually self-reinforcing. But he can't stop. He's got himself into that position now.
That is extremely important what we are seeing now. But before we go further deeper into this discussion of what are the sources of power in the next year's Russia, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel. If you have your ideas, you want to share them, write your comment under this video. We are talking to James Nixey, who is director at Russia Eurasia program at Chatham House in London. And you have already mentioned that the importance of gas and oil as a connectors to the West for the Russian regime will change after this war, or already changed during this war, and they will now return back to normality, we all hope. And who are those elites who are profiting from this Russo-Ukrainian war? Kremlin close friends of Vladimir Putin who own production of Lancet drones or other equipment are more important than Alexei Miller from Gazprom now.
Yes, Alexei Miller in Gazprom is simply a functionary. He doesn't have any sort of power base or ability to construct himself. He's not really contributing to the state. He's more of an administrator. But you're absolutely right that there are figures of great importance who Putin relies upon, who he puts pressure on to do their service, to tighten their belts, and we've seen this in the past. Do you remember that we said the head of Rusal said that he didn't mind whether his companies were state-owned or privately owned. It was all in the service of the state, and so he will get his closest friends and allies, who he has rewarded in the past, they get the juiciest contracts to build the the bridge over the Kerch Straits, or whatever you want to say it, and that is, I suppose, within the gift of an autocrat. He is able to command that power and that respect for now. And of course, we used to say, well, let's tighten the grip on the oligarchs, and that will increase the pressure upon Putin. But of course, that hasn't happened. I think we have to concede, Sergei, much as we might not like it, but there is a great deal of autocratic resilience. Autocracies are resilient. They are able to command respect from the people, extraordinarily as it may seem to you and me, and from the elites, even if they get poorer.
Is this what we see in Russia currently? This change of the elites? Is the Russian system of power getting more transparent or less transparent for the West? Can we come to the situation as during the Soviet era, when we have to guess, looking at the seldom official photo on mausoleum, who is staying where, and make our guess, like, is this Ministry of Defense or Ministry of medium-sized machinery, or other ministries are getting more important or less? Can we understand what is going on in Kremlin?
It is very hard to see inside the black box. The way in which we do it tended to be that we used to be able to invite Russians to the UK or wherever, to Germany, and we would ask them what it was like to walk in the corridors of power. And even then, of course, that had its limited value, because if you were to ask that of Mikhail Kasyanov, who was Putin's prime minister in the early years, then you would get a view which had a certain degree of poison and hatred, understandably, with it. And the ones who ultimately you really wanted to learn from, the ones who were closest to power, the Sechins and the Kiryenkos perhaps, or the I'm trying to think right now, but those were people who wouldn't come and speak to the West. But I think that one of the mistakes we made, Sergei, is we always got to meet the relatively nice people, the Shuvalovs and the Grefs, and the Kudrins, and they were not the people who were really responsible for Russia's ultimate direction. They were quite talented technocrats, they were good economists, but they don't have any say in the orientation of the Russian state. But those are the ones we met. Those are the ones who were sent out here. But we never met, really, the Sechins of this world, and the people who were really responsible for the inward or Eurasianist direction that Russia was already beginning to take in the early 2000s. We were so desperate that Russia would turn out well, but we tried to hide ourselves from the more malignant people who we could see, the people who, had copies of The Godfather distributed, or and all those anecdotes that we used to hear about, and we tried to say, well, yeah, but Kudrin's a good guy, and maybe so, but he was not in charge.
But was it not the situation that when people who really like Putin believe in his way of view on the history, and some people we know in Kremlin, they believe in all possible weird things, in Jewish conspiracy, in some sort of Western Masonic circles planning to destroy Russia. They are believing in numerology, obviously. We know that all the attacks that Putin planned, they were somehow like numerologically planned as 8th of August or 22nd of second month 2022. Yeah. You can assume that this way of thinking could be somehow alienating in the West, so we prefer to talk to technocrats who have lectured at LSE or in Harvard and could speak foreign languages, but never believe that people like Sechin or those are really the core of Putin's elite. And when we look now what is happening in Russia, we see that sometimes there are people dead in the elites. The son of Sechin is one of the last examples. We don't know what happened there, but he's not alone. People fall out of the windows. people put a bullet into their own head, sometimes before having killed their wives. Can we expect that this fight will continue, and what is it about?
Yeah. So I think there must be. I mean, we'll never really know, of course, until there is some reveal-all biography in a post-war autobiography in a post-war state. Exactly what was going on. But one assumes that the corridors of the Kremlin are not, tranquil, well organized, places from which power is excised with supreme confidence. I suspect it's a much more disorganized chaos than we imagine. But again, it's hard to see inside the black box. But we do know, if you recall, Sergei, the meeting of the Federation Council just a few days before the war, before the invasion in February 2022, and Putin clearly had not told many of his most senior ministers and functionaries what was going to happen. He asked them for their views and their reasonings, and most of them were they looked like they had been put in the hot spot and grilled, and they were embarrassed, and they really were. It really was quite an extraordinary sight. But of course, he did eventually marshal them into obedience. But at the time, it was quite a remarkable thing. So obviously, what they're thinking is very different to what they are saying. That's not to suggest they're closet liberals. They're not frustrated Democrats. Let's not give them any credit here. But I think it does mean that perhaps, as we have seen in the past from defectors, you probably do see, I suspect, as much as is possible in a paranoid state where people can be listened in on, increasingly so, that there might be murmurings of dissent and discontent just as there was in the late years of the Stalin regime. But whether that will come to fruition and actually mean anything in the end, whether that will cause the downfall, it's hard to say. But we do know that the Prague Spring did indeed create dissent and defectors such as Oleg Gordievsky, who was ultimately responsible for a great deal of the understanding and knowledge that we used to hasten the end of the Soviet regime. But again, it's very hard to see right now because nobody, and I really mean nobody in the West, is given that access anymore. I mean, at one point that was different, I think, but we are, I'm afraid, and I'm sorry to say this, as analysts, all a lot poorer for not being able to visit Russia, for not speaking to really anybody, let alone the Sechins and of this world, and so we are floundering a bit in our analysis. And we do the best that we can. We surmise on the basis of history, recent history and further back history. But I think we probably have to recognise our limitations whilst also not being naive about the direction and the nature of the Russian state.
This meeting you have mentioned was indeed a very illustrative event. It was obvious, as you said, that most of the participants did not expect what Putin will ask them. They looked more like peoples, like terrorized peoples in a school who want to find out what is the answer that the headmaster, the teacher expect from them, and that, okay, is it what I say now? Is it what he expects from me, or will I be punished, or will I be granted with some with some prize? And it was indeed a devastating view what happened there. But as you already mentioned, that Putin obviously limits his communication to very narrow circle of his advisors out of many reasons. From our perspective, this could lead to some weakness. But his decisions within the last months seem to be not that bad. Russia's war against Ukraine goes on. Russia is still not defeated. The West is reluctant on delivering weapons to Ukraine. In the US, we see a discussion which is maybe much inspired by Russia. We have the same development in Germany, in Poland, in other regions of the world. So this way of acting as a paranoid dictator, which he is, seems to be not that stupid. He is in power longer than any European leader.
Yeah, again, it goes back to my point about autocratic resilience. I mean, again, if you do hold those levels of power, if you do have the ability to dispense your largesse monetarily and in power terms, then that does help with your continuation. And I suppose, looked at a certain way, and you and I have trouble looking at it this way, Sergei, then Putin has made Russia great again, stood up to the West, stood up to the US, the great Satan or whatever. He has, Russia is not at the irrelevance of a joke that it was in Yeltsin's times. And he is on the way to making it a great power. Now, none of this, obviously, you and I, would laugh in the face of this, but that is definitely the. I can at least imagine how that is seen by some people in the populace and in the elite. That Putin may not be the best thing for their pockets and their living standards, but he is perhaps the best thing for the greater glory of Russia. If you believe in the greater glory of Russia and the gathering of Russian lands, and that Russia merits a seat at the top table, then I suppose Putin is your man. Now, of course, we can also see that Putin is driving himself into deeper trouble economically, technologically, educationally, politically, diplomatically, absolutely. So no argue. But I suppose, again, this is one of the problems I guess we have with Russia watchers is people assume almost a rational actor scenario, and he's only rational within the confines of his ultra-nationalist conservative mentality, his illiberal mentality. So for what it's worth, and it's not worth much, Sergei, but for what it's worth, I've never felt that money is his driving force. I've never even felt, bizarrely, that longevity is his driving force. His driving force, to me, has always been that Russia must be seen as a supreme global power to be respected and feared. And so that, to me, has been his number one driving priority. And you can argue it a number of different ways, so fair enough. But that, to me, explains why he has done what he has done, which is something he can never escape from now. He whilst I can concede a number of different possibilities for how this war might end, depending upon the feebleness or otherwise of Western assistance, that this is his defining moment. So he's gone all like a desperate gambler. He's gone all in, and he feels he's supported more or less by the Russian populace, because I don't think we should exonerate them. And he feels he is supported by the elite, albeit through fear. And so he has got the green light to go. And of course, we've also given him a green light, by the way, by allowing for grey zones to exist in this region.
Indeed, you have mentioned that he wanted to see Russia glorious, and he compared himself regularly to Catherine II or
Right.
Peter I. Not that often to Joseph Stalin,
Right.
although I believe that Stalin inspires him a bit, but Peter I and Catherine II are more safer figures from the history, as they are also respected and adored to some certain extent in the West.
Stalin was considered, as you know, Sergei, the greatest human being who ever lived in a poll of, 10, 15 years ago now, I forget. I mean, not just the greatest Russian, but the greatest human being.
Indeed, and that is what I wanted to ask you. If you have, as Putin has, the country where 20 to 30% of households do not have running water, when in province, like two-thirds outside of the bigger cities, two-thirds of households do not have running water, do not have access to sewer system. We have seen these videos recorded by Russian soldiers who invaded Ukraine when they entered Ukrainian villages and they were shocked. comparing the level of how Ukrainians
Right.
live in their villages to what they know in Russia. Recently, yesterday, I saw a video from Avdiivka, which Russians have conquered with devastating level of destruction, and the Russian soldiers entering a completely destroyed house in Avdiivka, and he's shocked by the level of how spacious the room is. The room is not spacious at all, but for him it is.
Yeah, it is astonishing to people like you and me, as you say, and I've seen those reports and those anecdotes as well, Sergei, where they couldn't believe they had access to Nutella in the cupboards or indoor toilets and that kind of stuff. So I've seen absolutely, and I guess again it's hard for us to understand because you and I vote for the person who's going to make us richer and the person who we regard as being the most moral person by and large. That's how we vote roughly. There are people in our countries who do vote for the people who will make the UK or Germany or France strong again, and that does happen. Of course, we're not immune to that. It just happens in greater numbers in a country like Russia, which let's not go into it too much, but feels it has this special destiny and there's something distinctive and unique about the Russian soul. So that's that. But there was a time, of course, when there was this unwritten contract between Putin and the people that if you stay out of politics, we will make you richer. And of course, that all stopped actually 10 years ago. Yeah, Russians were never as rich as they were in 2013, 2014. After that, it started going downhill. Of course, Putin, but it has, when we get back to the election conversation, and that does mean that he's had to work harder to manipulate his elections, but not impossibly so. I mean, there are various ways of doing this, and it's not beyond the realms of of their ability. I mean, I do think that we probably underestimate whilst I hope I'm not contradicting myself because I was talking about the chaos in the corridors of the Kremlin, no doubt. Then I also think we underestimate the capacity and capability of the Russian state when it really wants something to go hell for leather towards it. Because at the end of the day, look, Russians are spending 7.5% of GDP on the war, and we're spending less than 2% probably. So again, Russians are able to mobilize in every sense. They are able to mobilize technically, militarily, politically, economically, and mentally. So I guess that explains it, but it is an anathema to us.
But when we come back, as you mentioned already, to the topic of elections and the challenges for Putin and his inner circle after the elections, mobilization, I totally agree, will most probably take place. There are challenges within economy, within the loyalty of the elites. What can be theoretically cracking points for Russia after this election? Is it poverty? Is it like losses in war? Is it ethnic groups who feel to be oppressed?
The obvious answer is that we do need ultimately to put pressure on the regime and to find out where it does crack, and that does mean economic pressure and pressure in the war, and there's a degree of hope here. And by the way, I do think that, sorry, just to rewind slightly, economically, I don't think it's going to work. At least not fast enough. If we give Ukraine, I don't know, for the sake of argument, 2-3 years of survival on minimalistic weaponry assistance from the West, then I don't think the Russians are going to crack economically in that time. Yes, we're squeezing them, but that's far too slow. So it's got to be a combination in the same way that Russia uses a multi-spectrum approach in its disinformation warfare, in fact, in its warfare approach on the West, then that implies that we have to do the same back. So there can be squeezes, whether it's a zero trade policy over a period of, say, 2 years, whether it is obviously increased weaponry assistance. Obviously, the Germans have got to be pressed into giving Taurus missiles. It does seem as if they might go that way with the right amount of pressure exerted on Germany. Maximum diplomatic pressure. See if we can bring more countries on side in the non-Western world. That includes China, but it also includes global South. It is honestly, Sergey, it's very difficult. I feel I'm grasping at ideas for how to use and extract those cracking points, and that's because we're in an inherently difficult situation, the most difficult situation we have seen at least since the Cold War, and possibly even more serious than that, quite frankly, because when you think about it, even in the Cold War, they weren't using language like they are now. I mean, look at Biden's language in the last couple of days, telling Putin he's a son of a bitch, saying that he's got to, this guy's got to go. I mean, we never said that about Brezhnev or Andropov or even Stalin in a sense. So, I mean, I feel that we're in the fight of our lives. This is the war we have been preparing for. That is not fully understood in Europe, in most European capitals, to the extent that it should be. We talk a good game, but that is not translated into assistance at the front line. There is also a fixation on the front line, which is perhaps slightly unfair. It doesn't regard. Obviously, there's two other areas: the sea and the air. But I think we have got to keep prodding away and finding out what works and what doesn't, in the same way that the Russians do for us. One final point here, Sergei, is that it does seem perhaps, we don't really know what the Russian reaction will be, and that's because we haven't really tried. Now, we should be planning that there will be a reaction, and then so there should be a counter-reaction or a counter-reaction. And secondly, I think that every Russian atrocity should be met with a policy response. So if they blow up the Kharkovka Dam, that ought to have been met with a proper policy response, or the death of Navalny. But it's so that's my slightly inadequate solution for you, for what it's worth. But we need to be engaged in all areas, on all fronts. All of society approach, all of government approach, multi-government approach to get this done, and to give them the tools to finish the job, etc., etc. So I hope that's an answer, but I sense that it's not sufficient, because we're struggling. We're struggling with ourselves. We're struggling with our own values, as much as we are with Russia itself.
Indeed, and the scale of challenge and the stake we have now are incredibly high, and it is not only about Ukraine or even Europe. It is about the survival of the Western democracy, as Russia obviously has a plan to establish a domination of anti-democratic totalitarian regimes or dictatorial regimes in the world, together with China, with North Korea, Iran, and other nasty regimes. It was James Nixey. He's a director at Russia-Eurasia program at Chatham House in London. We have discussed what will happen in Russia within the next weeks, election of Vladimir Putin or re-election of Vladimir Putin, but most important, what comes next, what moves the Russian elites and the Russian nation. Thank you so much, James, for this interview.
Sergey, it's such a pleasure. Please, come back to us, and it's always an honor to work with you.
Thank you so much, and don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel, and write your ideas under this video, and wait for the new interviews.